All right, welcome everyone. It is so nice to have you here and see all your faces. Welcome back to the final green quarantine of our first season. We're doing this by season now. We have been doing this since March when the shutdown began, and it's nice to see so many faces that have been with us since then, learning every Thursday and in conversation. It has provided me with so much hope during this time and fortitude to be doing this with all of you. And I see some new faces joining us for the first time today. So welcome and thank you. And like every good season, good show, we have to end with one really awesome finale. And that is what we are here to do today, to end with a great finale that's going to leave all of us with a lot to think about during intermission. And so with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Taylor Morton. And like usual, you have to bear with me for a second because I want to make sure that I read everything that Taylor has done so far. We have, again, the great privilege to have Taylor Morton with us. Taylor Morton uses the pronouns she, they, and has been working with We Act for environmental justice in Harlem since 2016. First as an intern, then an environmental health fellow, and now as an educational consultant. Their work has included co-facilitating and creating for the organization's educational programs. Taylor also recognizes the importance of exposing minority, urban, and low-income youth to natural elements and actively supports this mission. Taylor holds a BS in Environmental Studies from Spelman College, an MS in Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management from the New School, and an MS in Education from the University of Pennsylvania. Taylor is awesome, and Taylor's with us today to talk about environmental justice. So as usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will have a time for Q&A and a discussion at the end. But for now, I turn the floor over to Taylor.
Thank you so much, Molly. I'm so excited to be with you all today. As you've heard in my bio, I am a forever student. My mother's deepest wish is for me to stop going to school. So, you know, always a student. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. There we go. All right, can you see it? Great. So my name is Taylor Morton. I'm the Environmental Health and Education Manager at We Act. I've been there for 5 years and, you know, have done just a little bit of everything, but now I'm working in the Environmental Health Department to share a little bit more about who we are. We Act has been around for about 30 years and really with the understanding that our built environment is not equitable. And all of that is intentional. And thinking about Manhattan specifically, Northern Manhattan, where more communities of color live, BIPOC communities, lower income communities. A lot of the built environment has been including an inequitable distribution of environmental hazards. And so that, you know, for us 30 years ago, that means, you know, bus depots, but also thinking about access to healthy foods and, spectrum of different issues that, impact environmental health and well-being. And our mission is to make sure that members of our community, folks who are considered underserved or underrepresented, have a say in the policies that are going to impact them around the environment. So that means meaningful participation as well as fair treatment when we're thinking about any type of initiative laws or policies or anything that impacts or changes our environment. We have a New York office, although we're all working from home, we have a New York office that handles our city and state policy, but we also have a federal office in DC that works on federal policy related to environmental justice. One thing I always like to start with whenever I'm working with students around different issues and different topics is I always say that we all have our own major hurricane. I'm originally from South Carolina, so my parents' major hurricane is Hurricane Hugo. Um, but my hurricane was Hurricane Katrina, and I think what was really different about this hurricane that was impactful to my life as a young person, and just seeing this on TV, was that not only were we having these conversations around these stronger storms that were coming, and seeing a strong storm that we'd never seen before, but there were also a lot of these images of Black and brown people who were crying out for help, and who needed resources, and just were completely left behind when it comes to Hurricane Katrina. And that warrants a different conversation. In my family, it warranted a different conversation about the ways that we look at race, not only from a social perspective, and including all of these things about class and wealth, but also including those conversations around environment. And I think when you think about Hurricane Katrina, it's also really particular case in looking at a community that's really been impacted by environmental justice issues for a long time. So Black and brown communities that have been impacted by chemical plants and all types of factories that have contributed to really high cancer rates, as well as poverty, but then adding in this environmental piece, this climate piece on top, as we see the effects of the storm, and thinking about the amount of resiliency that wasn't there, that resulted in lives lost. So making the case for climate justice. Climate justice connects to many other justices. I very much think of it as a baby of environmental justice, and the two are very well tied together. But climate justice also relates really closely to racial justice, as well as class, and even thinking about language justice. And it's sort of born of all of these other movements as well, thinking about immigration and workers' rights and farmers' rights. But when we think about climate justice, it's also good to keep in mind that these injustices can hinder youth learning and development as well. So when we're seeing all of these different events, whether we're seeing land being lost due to sea level rise, or communities being left behind after natural disasters and not having the resiliency to continue on, there are a lot of different groups within the groups that we should think about. Thinking about youth, thinking about the two vulnerable groups that are more vulnerable in our populations, which is in some cases of what we're seeing now with COVID, which are the elderly, and thinking about like babies and children, right? So all of that to say, climate justice really spans a lot of different communities, and within those communities, different groups of people who are considered more vulnerable, or may have their own learning and development disrupted. We work on a lot of different focus areas. This is certainly not an end all be all of what we do. We do a lot of work around within climate justice around energy efficiency, as well as green infrastructure, emergency preparedness as well. But we have running campaigns that are related to the needs of our members, as well as what's coming up around policy. So I do a lot of work personally around public housing in New York City related to healthy homes, and thinking about lead and mold and indoor environmental health. But as we have grown over the past 30 years, we've been able to see a resurgence at different times of these issues. And in a lot of cases and instances, we've been able to have a lot of wins, and in others, we are still fighting a lot of these battles, and will continue to fight these battles for a really long time. Thinking about what environmental justice is. Environmental justice, we're thinking about the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. This also extends to, many of other identity factors, definitely not limited to those. But, as I mentioned before, really making sure that all of the inequities that were formed and started intentionally, wanting to make sure that there is some type of solution for those issues. We want to make sure that we are seeing a response not only to, a moment in time, but also looking at the long-term impact of these issues on folks. I would love to see, maybe in the chat box, if anyone has any examples of either an environmental justice community or environmental justice issues. Can you think of any instances or seen in the news, maybe, any environmental justice issues? Yep, so looking at water quality in Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey, specifically around lead. So if we're thinking about flooding in India, that's more of climate justice. What we see of, and this is a good delineation too. So what we see of Flint, what's happening in Flint, Michigan, and what's happening in Newark, New Jersey around lead pipes is more environmental justice. We're thinking about things that are more systemic in nature, and they can certainly have those issues exacerbated by climate issues, but what we're seeing with sea level rise or flooding in India could also have to do more with climate justice. We'll talk a little bit more about climate justice in a moment. Pesticide exposure, that's a really big issue, especially as we think about not only about like workers' rights, but also about food justice. So that's a really good one. Looking at water qualities, access to healthy food, all of those are really great. If you're near a community that's going through oil drilling in the Arctic, all really, really great examples. So you all have some idea of what these environmental justice issues are. This is a really great one as well, looking at coal dumping in rivers in West Virginia. And I think a really important piece of looking at environmental justice, thinking about Appalachian communities as well. A lot of what we see in environmental justice is race-based. So there's environmental racism, which is an environmental injustice, and the response to that is environmental justice. However, we can see environmental discrimination around class as well. So that may mean that folks who live in Appalachian areas are white, but because they are considered a lower income community, folks have chosen to capitalize on that in order to expose them to more environmental hazards, either due to not wanting to live closer to those hazards or being able to make money off of having those hazards in a specific place. Great. The environmental justice movement is very much a child of the civil rights movement. Can anyone, so we all know this is Dr. King. Does anyone know what happened in April in Memphis, Tennessee to Dr. King? You can throw it in the chat. I believe it's April, I think 11th or 18th. Maybe April 4th. What happened in Memphis, Tennessee? Yeah, Dr. King was assassinated. So a really important piece of this, while Dr. King was in Memphis, he was also working around sanitation workers' rights. And sanitation is a really, it's a really big start for what we see in environmental justice, and understanding that environmental justice issues have definitely spanned past the civil rights era. We see a certain resurgence around this time. Landfills are really, really, really big environmental justice issue, as we see in this picture in Warren County, North Carolina, and this picture in Houston, Texas, in Whispering Pines. They're a really big issue because the placement of a landfill area can be the beginning of environmental health issues for communities. There's a really popular case in Dixon, Tennessee, that the NRDC, I saw you all are sponsored by the NRDC. NRDC handled a case where this woman found out that everyone in her family had cancer, and they've had cancer for years. So she was trying to figure out, why are we going through this? Why is this happening to our family, to our community? And she found out that they were living next to a landfill, and the chemicals from the landfill seeped into the well that they were using for water, right? So not really knowing or understanding why they were getting sick, but realizing like you need water to live. As they're using the water, other people are, people in their family are getting sick. But the community that they lived in was a historically Black community that had been there for years and had a lot of the makeup of the town was, goes as far back into Reconstruction, right? So understanding there's a really deep-seated understanding of the way that cities are built, and there was an intentional effort to put a landfill here. And so she was able to sue and won the case and against the city. But that doesn't happen, in a lot of cases doesn't happen very often, but we see, especially around the 1960s, a resurgence of a lot of civil disobedience against landfills that are being moved to certain communities, or in some places where landfills already exist, folks are saying, this is actually contributing to, this is actually contributing to poorly impacting our health, and that's really, we're not going to stand for that anymore. So all of that to say, a lot of the actions that we see around environmental justice and climate justice today take a lot of note from the civil rights movement. And not only that movement, but looking at different farmers' rights, workers' rights movements, all of those sort of merge depending on the focus area of, what's being, fought against. A lot of those actions come from those places. We talked a little bit about environmental justice events. We spoke about a lot of pipeline issues. There are a lot of effects against indigenous communities, communities of different races, especially Black communities. And one really big, so you can have environmental justice events, and a lot of those are seeded by longstanding issues in an area. But a lot of what we see, if we're thinking about places like Louisiana as well, is that a lot of those issues, if they're not solved in a timely manner, can build up. So we see a place like, so this picture is taken in Louisiana. We see a place called Cancer Alley. And it's basically these groups of Black neighborhoods that are built right next to chemical plants. And so we see, similar to the NRDC case, really big, a really big and disproportionate amount of cancer rates in one area. And as a result of that has an impact on life expectancy. In Harlem, when thinking about We Act, a lot of our work in the beginning was around bus depots and really looking at why all of the bus depots in Manhattan were above 96th Street. And understanding the health issues with living next to a bus depot. And that may not mean that, that may mean that your child has an increased rate of asthma. That may mean that you have to take off work to take care of your child. And as a result, your whole family has a lower life expectancy. So a lot of our earlier campaigns were around changing the types of fuel that the buses use, which we've been able to make a lot of progress with that, but also branching into other issues. There's looking at, the damage around wastewater treatment plants and, a spectrum of other issues, and understanding that a lot of these issues won't be handled in even a couple of years, but it will take a lot of work to manage the situation and understand that all of these things are changing. And that's what I would say for, a lot of these events on this page. And this is certainly not, the end all be all of environmental justice events or anything like that, but something to consider and just understand that a lot of communities have their own environmental justice issues that they're working through or working on. So what is climate justice? So we're thinking about rising temperatures, human lives. We're thinking about people of color, BIPOC communities, lower income communities, indigenous communities, folks who are affected first and worst. And the effects that we see are as a compromised health, financial burdens. And really, the answer would be having resiliency to respond to these issues and prepare and do what you need to do to maintain a healthy life. And as I mentioned before, we've been able to see a lot of that with Hurricane Katrina. We're seeing that now with a lot of other hurricanes. Who has the ability to leave, who has the ability to rebuild, whose health is not going to be impacted by these issues. What we saw after Hurricane Katrina as well, thinking about gentrification, is that I was actually on a call with some students yesterday, and I got to talk to a student who said that she was a student who was identified as African American, but was displaced after Hurricane Katrina, and really, she was saying, going back and visiting, understanding that gentrification is also taking place at that time. So we see an event where horrible things are happening, people are being forced to leave, and when we're coming back and things are being rebuilt, gentrification coming in and really playing a role in pushing out further folks in lower income communities as a point of revitalization for business. But climate justice is a lot of different aspects, a lot of those rooted in health and a lot of those rooted in resiliency, as well as a lot around finance and economics. When we seek climate justice, we want to make sure that we're protecting vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, and that there is a sharing of burdens. So that will mean understanding that folks don't have money to move if a bad event happens. Folks don't have the ability to be resilient, either in short term or long term, when we're thinking about a lot of these climate justice issues. And that's very much, I would say, building the plane as you fly, right? Because even what we're seeing now with COVID, the plans for resiliency are always changing, and really understanding that due to a lot of environmental justice issues, so what we're seeing that African American communities, Latinx communities, other communities who have had historically compromised health are at higher risk when we look at COVID. They're at higher risk when we think about any other situations that may compromise health and well-being. So climate justice and environmental justice very much tie together, and they do have, there are a lot of differences, but we want to make sure that there's a focus on human rights, social justice, and providing those fair opportunities and meaningful involvement along the way. Before I continue, I can stop and take a couple questions. I know that was a lot to digest in one moment. So feel free to answer out loud or throw in the chat if you would like. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. Oh. What has been my experience with traditional education, brick and mortar learning environments, and proper environmental justice education? That's a great question. We are working on a lot of educational initiatives currently. I think my experience is, so I don't know if you all are from New York State, you may or may not be, but New Jersey, if there are any New Jerseyans, New Jerseyanites on the call, New Jersey is the first state to mandate that climate change be taught in schools. And that is a really huge step. So that's a really big component when thinking about learning about environmental justice and climate justice. I think I very much lean towards the decolonization of how environmental justice and climate justice is taught in schools. So That's a little bit easier when you are, part of a nonprofit, when you're not in a traditional school setting. You can kind of do what you want, but we're really thinking that when we're thinking about decolonizing environmental justice and climate justice education and education as a whole, we're really thinking about traditionally education is being taught from, I am the teacher, you are the student. I am the giver of information. I am telling you what you need to know, without acknowledging that students have their own experiences that they bring to the table and seeing those experiences as valid. And really starting with that, starting with student experiences as a place of learning around some of these issues. And student experience doesn't have to mean, putting the burden on students who are directly impacted by these things, but can also, mean processing for students who aren't a part of climate justice or environmental justice communities, but being able to see that in a broader perspective on a city scale. And I mean, the thing about the built environment, it's very easy to ride around town and sort of see the ways that cities have been segregated and the different ways that sort of happens. And, even towns and, small towns and stuff like that. So all of that to say, I think it takes a combination of all of these things. There definitely is a need for traditional education for us to include these concepts. Because the tricky part of learning this material outside of school is that it either takes time. If you are working a job, you don't have time to come and do this. It takes, time away from any other family commitments or things that you're working on. So what we might find is students who need this the most may not have it, fixed or prioritized in their time to engage in this material, even though it is really important. And what we would find with it not being in the school system or with it not being standardized is that it's a really important thing for students to learn. It's an important thing for students to know, but they're not getting that education. And that's the benefit of having outside groups also do education and really focusing on places where this education is needed most for students to become resilient adults who can challenge these systems and think critically about ways to survive in the long term. So I think my answer is there needs to be a hybrid of things, and it needs to be mandatory for all students, but the path towards making that happen isn't quite so clear. And I think in some states it's quite difficult if we're looking at it as a statewide, sort of initiative. Hope that answered your question. Cool. I'm gonna push forward, and then at the end, you all will have some time. I'm sure we'll have some time to ask more questions. So what is a frontline community? We very much tie, you may have seen like on the news or on TV, we tie frontline communities to climate justice. We call environmental justice communities EJ communities normally. But as I mentioned before, we're thinking about communities that experience the climate changes first and worst, and also don't have the ability to respond or remain resilient. And a lot of that is due to systemic structures and history and resource distribution. That's a really huge part of climate justice. But as I mentioned before, there are a lot of different communities that qualify as frontline communities, and then there are a lot of communities that identify as both. So we're thinking about communities in Louisiana who are impacted by Hurricane Katrina. A lot of that is both, and it's a pretty blurry line because a lot of what we see in communities who don't have a lot of resiliency is that they've been impacted by environmental justice issues for a longer time. But I think all of this to say, this is just like a starting place to see how those things differ. If we're thinking about something like water quality in Flint, Michigan, that's more of an environmental justice issue. If we're thinking about sea level rise for a community in the Maldives, then that is more of a climate justice issue, regardless of scope. I wanted to talk also about life expectancy. As I mentioned before, a thing that I always talk about is you can tell your life expectancy by your zip code, and that is a known fact. And there's a lot of information that New York City has out on life expectancy in different neighborhoods, and acknowledging that there is a gap. And those gaps are really highlighted by what we call social determinants of health. So things in our social lives that will end up impacting our health. So race is a social determinant of health. Class and wealth is a social determinant of health. Thinking about access to healthcare, access to healthy food, access to education, all of those things come together and can be calculated in our life expectancy and what we really see when we look at the data of how long people are living in certain communities. And the goal from an environmental justice perspective would be to make these as even as possible, to make sure that the burden isn't being put on only one community. So one community that we serve, for example, is Central Harlem. And Central Harlem's average life expectancy is 5 years shorter than New York City overall. And we'll talk a little bit about more about these maps in a second as we go through. There's a really great tool. I'm going to put it in the chat so you can play with it. There's a really great tool done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. There are a lot of tools like this, but they can tell you and they can calculate life expectancy, and life expectancy is a really big indicator of environmental health. The tough part will become like sparsing out some of those issues and which part is being a bigger contributor to lower or higher life expectancy. But I just wanted to show you a little bit of how this tool could be used, or how you would see this manifest. So if we're looking at Atlanta versus New York, the life expectancy, is 80 years, give or take, versus 85 years. And if we're looking at the expectancy of the United States, it's 78 years, but really understanding that this is really key to understanding what progress we have made or need to make around these issues, but can be a really good tool in highlighting disparities when we're looking at like spatial arrangements. So just as a further example, if we're looking at, race and ethnicity, and this is data from the city, if we're looking at race and ethnicity in New York City, and there are a lot of other maps if you're not in New York City or in New York State that also highlight similar things. We can see this is where our catchment area is Northern Manhattan, but a lot of issues that are really impacted in different maps tend to show trends across the scale. So we're seeing the percent non-white is higher in Northern Manhattan, is certainly higher in the Bronx and in parts of Brooklyn and Queens, as well as St. George, Staten Island, and the Far Rockaways. So if we look at some of these other maps, if we're looking at heat vulnerability, so heat vulnerability is huge in New York City currently, thinking about, especially around COVID, if you're stuck inside and you don't have an air conditioner and the temperature inside of your house is, 90 degrees plus, you're at higher risk for heat stroke. And if you are already dealing with a lot of other pre-existing health conditions, right, all of those things overlap to really contribute to a poor life expectancy. But we see a lot of these trends as well in Northern Manhattan and the Bronx, as well as parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. And so all the areas that we're seeing are areas that are repeatedly dealing with different issues. We're thinking about asthma rates, a really big part of environmental health when we're thinking about indoor environmental health specifically is the presence of mold. mold in the home, especially when we're thinking about kids. If you are a child who grows up with mold in the home, you develop asthma. You're having to be in and out of school. Your parent is having to take you out, but it's something we're seeing around COVID, right? If you are, a kid who grew up with asthma and you found out, oh, I have asthma, it's due to mold in my apartment, I'm not able to get rid of it through my landlord, and that's a whole other issue, right? You are at higher risk for COVID, right? That becomes a really big deal. We can also look at house maintenance. So we're looking at homes that have peeling paint, so homes that have lead. And lead is especially a big issue when we think about children as far as development and behavior and abilities to learn. But we see as well a lot of these same areas having these same trends of issues. And that doesn't mean that other areas don't also have pop-ups of these different problems, but what we're seeing is some areas have really built up and long-standing relationship with these issues. I did have a couple of books that I wanted to suggest if you all were interested in getting a good head start in environmental justice. Particularly The Color of Law. It's a little bit dense, but it's a great, amazing resource to get some more historical context around land use in the United States, as well as looking at it from an equity perspective, as well as Clean and White, which gives more of a background around environmental racism in the United States. But that's pretty much all I had as like a running start, and that's pretty much a foundation for understanding both climate justice and environmental justice, and understanding that all of this work changes as we deal with new issues and new strategies come up with figuring out how to make a more equitable world for everyone. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Will it be okay? Can we send this list of books in our follow-up email to everyone?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. At this point, if people do want to click on their videos, whoever is comfortable, that would be really helpful for the discussion section here. Great. I have a question to open up with for you, Taylor.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no, we have one from Stephen. Let's start with there. Stephen, do you want to click on and ask your question?
Sure.
Can we open up the video larger?
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so we're a theater maker group. What can we do, right now? I mean, we reach a lot of people. We have, things that I'm an artistic director. My choices, reach a lot of people every year about what we do. We do Shakespeare. We don't do directly environmental plays. Mm-hmm. But where, and I should say I'm a resident of Central Harlem, so I'm raising my family. So this is a big issue for me. It's something I think about a lot. And we can do internal green practices and things like that, and even the way we produce. But what can we do that could help you guys? I know it's a hard question, but
no, it's a great question. A lot. So first of all, you can become a WEAC member. That's a really big part of it. We have meetings every second Saturday of the month on a lot of these topics. There are a lot of really great environmental justice groups in New York City, New York State, and on a national scale. I think a good start is if you follow any of them on social media, any of the events that they are raising awareness about, fundraising or anything like that. A lot of them are hosting webinars for different events. Those are really good things to get involved in. Another thing that can definitely be done, is kind of thrown around a lot, but contacting your elected official, so your city council member, any, on a larger scale representative, of course, but especially your local representatives about what is happening in the city. For example, in New York City, there's a really big, as I mentioned before, there's a lot happening around heat in the city, and making sure that people are not also dying from COVID on top of heat exposure. So contacting your elected official just to throw support around those initiatives is really important. Those are some of the starter areas that I'm sort of thinking about. The contacting your elected officials part is really big as well, is because a lot of groups that work around housing, especially, or environmental justice, are at max capacity when working around COVID. Even, we work in a number of housing coalitions, and, between COVID and trying to make sure that, trying to work on rent, the rent moratorium, utilities moratorium, looking at health effects, trying to make sure NYCHA has more money. Between all of those things, they may not be thinking about heat exposure. So I will say there are certainly a lot of things going around that need to be advocated for. Another thing that you could do, I think, is a less, it's like a less pretty answer, but I think for me, growing up, I had my own experience of environmental justice when I was being born and raised in South Carolina, and moving to New York is a very different, it's a very different sort of thing. So I think taking time to re-educate yourself around what environmental justice is, environmental justice is really hard to, I think in some cases, really hard to learn about, because it spans so many different topics. Like environmental justice, even in New York City, is different than it is in Rochester. It's different than it is in Syracuse and Albany. But I think it's difficult to help when you don't have a better understanding of how those situations sort of came to be. And I think that gives a lot of insight into how elected officials especially represent those issues. And it gives a lot of insight into how things are funded, looking at city issues as well. Public housing, I think, is a really big one that, it's a lot of, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around a lot of those issues, but I think there are a lot of more localized answers that can be given by starting with following some other EJ groups, educating yourselves, and then seeing what your local elected official is up to. And federal elected officials as well.
Can you talk a little bit about NYCHA?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at WeAct are working on, you mean like NYCHA as a system, or like our work at NYCHA?
Really both.
Okay. So there's a long history of public housing, especially in New York City. And public housing initially was created for more of like middle-class white folks. And it was really well-funded and well kept up for it. And then somewhere around the 80s, as we were seeing a lot of new issues come around BIPOC communities and drugs especially, and policing, like over-policing, there was a switch. So there are a lot of, the intake for public housing now became for, folks who are considered, lower income communities or communities of color, BIPOC communities. And at that time, we really saw a change in the way that public housing was carried out. So there, at times were more funds for certain, over policing. We started to see a divestment from the funds for public housing for maintenance deficiencies and stuff like that. So the funding that was put in for upkeep stopped coming. And that's really where we've seen And a lot of that switches around as far as like moving forward in public housing, maintenance and moving backwards. But especially in the past, maybe like 10 years, we've really seen a defunding of money for uptake and upkeep. So what we see now is, the little mold issues that existed, a couple of years ago became mold growing in the concrete because it wasn't dealt with at any point in time. And what we see of, at some point, like, we realized that peeling paint was bad, and understanding that a lot of the paint used past before the 1960s had lead in it. So there was a really big movement to get that remediated and abated and make sure that people weren't living in homes that had lead paint. But what we've seen in public housing is that a lot of the apartments have lead in on the walls, right? And a lot of folks either don't know about it and haven't gotten it tested. And the ticketing system is so dysfunctional that people can put in a ticket for 1 year and they don't get someone who comes for 2 years later to come and fix the issue. And fixing the issue has also been a problem. So, part of it is you're supposed to scrape up all the paint from the walls, and at that point the dust becomes, poisonous to your health. But we see, NYCHA as being accountable hasn't moved people out of the buildings when they're doing the abatement, which means you're breathing in the lead paint chips, or they may just paint over the paint instead of chipping it up. So as a result, there was a really big, if you go online, there's a really big, I guess, investigation in, all of the claims that people had put in, and NYCHA was basically saying, we fixed all these issues, but it come to find out that they hadn't. And there were kids who were living in those buildings. And in a lot of cases, kids have developed cancer. Kids have had really severe, health impacts that no one has been held accountable to. So there's a recent agreement within the past year between NYCHA and HUD, so the federal government, to fix these issues. So saying that NYCHA needs to spend the money to fix these issues, and after they fix the issues, they will be reimbursed for the funds. But what we're seeing now is with COVID especially, there's a difficulty in either wanting someone to come into your home. You're spending all this time, in an apartment that potentially has lead, that has mold, that has all these other issues. There's a conflict with wanting folks to come in, wanting to be safe, and living in an apartment that is already jeopardizing your health. So that's a little bit over like the, what's happening in public housing now. What we're doing is starting a campaign with residents who live there around the 2021 mayoral election, and understanding that whoever is going to be the mayor will be able to best indicate how funds are spent for public housing. So the goal would be to have someone who is going to invest the time and the money in fixing all of these issues. We have, I think, aside from Puerto Rico, the largest number of public housing developments in the nation. And that is, that's a lot of people who are feeling really horrible health impacts and don't really have an accountability system that's going to help them figure it out. But a lot of times they're just spinning their wheels and feeling helpless. So that's also something to keep in mind. It's a big part of our work, but something that's also left out. And I think there are a lot of like public housing developments depending on where you live in, New York City or New York State, in your local town near you. But it's also worth it to see with your local official if there's anything going on with those specific developments that can also be supported. So the public housing in the U.S. is definitely worth a big look, but there's a historically, in a lot of ways, insidious background behind public housing in New York City. Someone asked some names of other EJ groups you can follow on social media. There's a group called El Puente. They do a lot of work in the Bronx. There's also Ironbound Community Corps. If you want to stay closer to like the Newark lead situation, Ironbound Community Corporation, they do a lot of different, they work on a lot of different areas, but they have a really good environmental justice group to focus on. The NAACP also has an EJ chapter. They do a lot of work around climate as well. They do a really good spread of like all of the justices. So if you want to keep up with racial, environmental, climate at the same time, they do a pretty good spread of those. Trying to think of what else. Activists are something else. Activists are also like worth like taking time to look at and understand as well. And I think the key is looking outside of environmental justice. So I would also look for anyone who's working in housing as well, because housing relates to a lot of environmental justice issues. So there's a group called Housing Justice for All. They do a lot of work around housing, a lot of stuff that they send me texts all the time, just about like, you know, here's what you can do, here's how you can help, sign these petitions, do these things, all that kind of stuff. So I can also in our follow-up send some names of some groups that we've worked closely with that you all can follow up with and see, you know, what piques your interest. Any suggestions for focusing energy? In my work, I work around 2 subject areas, and that's housing and education. But I have colleagues who work in different areas. So like one only works in city policy, one only works in state policy and federal policy. I think a good approach to climate and environmental justice is really thinking that it can be really hefty on its own. So if there are like 1 or 2 smaller areas that you want to focus on, or like 1 or 2 communities, like, you know, maybe you're like, lead in New Jersey is really important to me and housing is really important to me, then I would start with that approach and see where it goes. Yeah, I think the key to doing that is making sure that you're acting in solidarity with everyone else's work. So I think as someone who cares a lot about climate justice and environmental justice, but also cares a lot about LGBTQ rights and also cares a lot about racial justice, and knowing that not only can I do all of it as one person, but it's exhausting and it takes a lot of time and investment, that I try to do what I can for the EJ movement and just, you know, act in solidarity for all of the other movements, whether that's sharing information, resources, donating, following people on any social media sites who may have good information about you know, resource distribution, or, you know, where I can show up, then I think that's a good strategy.
Taylor?
Yeah.
Yeah, I cut you off if you're not finished.
No, please.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you for that, and it so beautifully ties into one of the key principles we have here at the BGA, which is that all of our actions, big or small, add up, and that's what moves us forward. And so, you know, I hear you, Jacob, when you say that it feels like, you know, there's endless opportunity, and there are definitely days I wake up and I read the news or I read all of these incredible groups are doing. I hear, you know, I listen to Taylor, your things, and I think, okay, well, I have 24 hours in the day, and if I did divide that up, each hour I can, but that, you know, I love what you just said, Taylor, which is find what moves you and contribute my piece. And then, you know, there's how many people on here right now? 22. So if we each do our bit, it's all going to add up, and we're going to move that needle. So thank you.
Yeah,
I'm aware of the time, so I don't know, Taylor, if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up here.
I don't think so. I will throw my email. I will throw my email in the chat if you have any, you want to reach out. We do like, I guess we don't do like theater stuff. There's this thing called, I'm going to look it up so I can throw it in here. It's called, we just had someone had like a comedy show. It's based on an inconvenient truth. I'm gonna see if I can find it. It's in here.
If not, we will definitely include it in our follow-up tomorrow.
Yeah, no, there are definitely we have like intersections with groups who don't work directly in the environment. So if you have any thoughts and ideas on ways that theater can intersect with the work that we're doing in the climate movement, environmental justice movement, definitely interested in hearing and seeing where it goes.
That's an excellent challenge that I believe will be accepted by many on this call. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, we all have to give a big silent congratulations to Taylor, who got married this weekend.
Yeah.
So yeah, congratulations, Taylor. I had to throw that out there. That's just too exciting. So thank you, Taylor. Thank you for joining us on your wedding week for this incredible presentation. Thank you to all of you for joining us. That's a wrap to season 1. We are going to take an intermission and we will be back in September. We already have speakers booked. We are going to be kicking off with Emily O'Brien, who is the executive director of Earth Angel, and she will be talking about how we make film and TV sustainable, and there's tons of crossover to be learned from her. We're going to be learning from an expert, Charles D. Segunda, on how to use our money to be more sustainable and how to make sustainable investments. Those of you like me who might be curious, how is my bank making, is my money in fossil fuels? He's going to answer those questions. So we'll be back. Come join us in the fall. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your summer. Thank you again, Taylor, and we'll see you then.
Have a good one. Bye.